Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm Sandrine Buteau, I'm the director of Albertine Bookstore, and it's a great honor and it's a great pleasure to welcome for the first time Hervé Le Tellier at Albertine, and to host again Katie Kitamura and our former dear colleague Laurence Marie. I'm sure it will be an important conversation on using fiction as a strategy for understanding reality. This event is part of the 10th anniversary celebrations of Albertine. It was made possible by Villa Albertine and by the generous contributions of donors and partners to the Albertine Books Foundation. I will introduce you briefly our three speakers. Hervé Le Tellier is a writer, journalist, editor, mathematician, linguist, food critic, and teacher. He has been a member of the Olipo Group since 1992 and one of the papus of the famous France Culture radio show. He has published numerous books of stories, essays, novels, and a memoir, including the 2020 Goncourt Prize-winning The Anomaly, translated by Adriana Hunter and published by Author Press. The Anomaly has sold more than 1 million copies worldwide and will soon be adapted for television. Katie Kitamura, her most recent novel is Intimacies, published by Riverhead Books in 2022. It was one of the New York Times 10 best books of that year. It was also longlisted for the National Book Award and the PEN Faulkner Award and was a finalist for the Joyce Carol Oates Prize. Katie Kitamura's work has been translated into 21 languages and is being adapted for film and television. A recipient of the Rome Prize in Literature and fellowships from the Lannan, Santa Maddalena, and Jan Michalski Foundations, Katie Kitamura has written for publications including the New York Times, The Guardian, and Granta, among others. She also teaches in the creative writing program at New York University. Moderating this conversation is Laurence Marie, a lecturer in the Department of French at Columbia University. A specialist for the 18th century literature, theater and the arts, and the history of emotions, Laurence Marie is the author of several books, including Inventer l'acteur, Émotions et spectacles dans l'Europe des Lumières, published by Gallimard. Previously, Laurence Marie was a professor at the Sorbonne University in Paris, a freelance writer for French media, a speechwriter and advisor to French minister, and a books and ideas attaché here at the Embassy of France of the United States. She participated in the creation of Albertine's books, which are celebrating together this weekend. So the conversation will last 45 minutes, followed by the 15 minutes Q&A, and the signature will be into the store like the previous one. I leave you the floor. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Oh yeah, okay. Thank you, Sandrine, for your very nice introduction. I'm absolutely thrilled, of course, to be here to celebrate with you the 10th anniversary of Albertine Bookstore. So as Sandrine mentioned, I was here 10 years ago when we opened this bookstore. It was a long adventure with a very nice team, and I'm so happy, such a joy to see that 10 years later it's really thriving. I want to thank, of course, everyone here at Albertine, at Villa Albertine. And thank you so much for organizing this amazing festival with such a great lineup of writers. More than ever, I think literature and ideas are particularly important. They're important because they help us challenge our views, see beyond stereotypes, appearances, help to think critically, and so this festival does it really beautifully. And I'm so honored to be moderating this conversation with these two great writers who do that also very beautifully. Thank you very much to both of you, to Katie Kitamura and Hervé Le Tellier, to be here with us this afternoon. So the title of the panel, I found it pretty intriguing at first when I was asked to moderate this panel. So literature, a playground or a battlefield. This, of course, particularly resonates with the form and the themes of your works, but also it particularly resonates with the political political events at the moment. So I guess you came maybe to get a definite answer about the definition of literature, thanks to our writers. I don't know if they're going to give us a definite answer about that, playground or battlefield, but as a parent, I certainly know that a playground can become like a pretty chaotic battlefield. And I would like to explore this tension between playground and battlefield, not only in the very obvious political sense, like literature is, of course, a political tool, but also to see how, to explore with you both, how your creative experiment, your literary experiment, can be a way to make literature a battlefield in a less obvious way. So I feel there's a very strong common features between your works. They both tackle the question of interpretation, the question of ambiguity in different ways, and notably how to make sense of the instability of the world, of the reality around us. So Katie, I would like to start with you, if it's okay. So the narrator of your last three novels is an unnamed female protagonist, so we know very little about her. In a separation, so the novel you wrote in 2017, sorry, I had it somewhere. She is a translator. In Intimacies, the other novel, she's an interpreter at The Hague. And in Audition, the novel that's forthcoming in the spring, I have it here. So she's an actress, something that is also to do with interpretation and performance. So it's very fascinating the way that Katie Kitamura's work deals with the difficulty to read, the difficulty to interpret, the way people behave, the way people speak. So you literally really complicate the idea of interpretation, of translation, by playing by this concept of truth. So could you tell us a little bit more about that aspect, this choice, and maybe the symbolism attached to this idea of interpretation, translation, and performance? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to quickly say what a thrill and an honor it is to be here as part of the 10th anniversary celebrations. I think in 10 years, Albertine has become so critical to the landscape of literature in New York, and it's thanks to everybody here that we're able to meet our great heroes, that they come to New York and that we can have these encounters. So it's really a thrill to be here. So as Laurence said, in all of my novels, I have unnamed female protagonists who are very much channels for the language of other people. And I think they are interpreters in different ways, but they are very, very rarely authors of language itself. And so something that's very, very interesting to me is what happens to language when it passes through a body. How does it change that body? How does that body change that language? And so I suppose part of that is a sense of true instability, in that the language's meaning is rarely fixed. And I try to do that in the sentences themselves, which are very much interested in interpretation. So very often the sentences that I write are structured in the kind of, it could be A, or it could be B, or it could be C, which leads to a kind of instability in your perception of the reality around you. I'm very rarely interested in speaking in the absolute. I'm much more interested in uncertainty, and that is a register in which I write. I should add that I had not written a great deal in the first person until I started writing these novels. And I think one of the things that had always struck me as very difficult about writing first person is the kind of mantle of authority that a first person voice can often claim. And inhabiting authority is something I'm really not interested in as a writer. I'm interested in questioning authority. I'm interested in thinking about how authority is composed and constructed. And so I think as soon as I realized I could use the first person to kind of inhabit a position of uncertainty rather than certainty, that voice opened up for me, and it became a voice of interpretation.
Well, thank you. It's a very interesting question of authority. Maybe we'll get to that later. Hervé Le Tellier. So you basically never published the same novel, the same book. So you are like such an eclectic writer. The range of the forms, the themes that you use is pretty incredible and fascinating too. And you always know how to beautifully surprise us. And you did so with your last two books. So L'Anomaly et Le Nom sur le mur, the name on the wall. So you're very well known here as a writer, as a member of the Oulipo. So Oulipo, as you know, is an acronym from Ouvroir de littérature potentielle, Workshop for Potential Literature, and where constraints appear as a stimulus for imagination. And you also write poetry, you write theater, you write novels that draw from different genres. And just to talk about L'Anomaly, your main protagonist, Victor Miesel, is the author of a book itself called The Anomaly, L'Anomaly. Is also a translator, so that's a common thing between your two books. And the novel deals with the duplication of reality. I don't want to tell too much about it in case you haven't read it yet, because there's like a twist that is really fascinating. And so your novel deals also with the difficulty of making sense of reality. So could you tell us more about this, how it is an underlying theme in your work, this question of interpretation, of making sense of the reality? Thank you.
Well, to me, and I think for every writer and for every living being speaking a language, there is an impulse coming from language on the world, which means that we don't have the same world if we don't have the same words. I was always surprised that the simple sentence of a French song of Charles Trenet, which is Le soleil a rendez-vous avec la lune, which is the sun has a meeting with the moon. For us, it's a man which is meeting a woman. For you, it is a neutral meeting a neutral. But for a German person, it is a woman who is going to meet a man. And in France, the woman is late, and the man is waiting. But for the German, it's the man who is late, and the woman is waiting. So it's a very different story. So I think the words shape the world, and this shape of the world, which is indicated by the language we are using, is extremely important, and it changes not only our side of the world, but our relationship with the world. And this is a question which is I always have in my head when I'm writing, and sometimes I should have it for the titles that I choose, which are untranslatable in other languages. And this is an interesting question for a writer, is how you are writing sometimes a chapter in a language which isn't yours, which I did in The Anomaly, where I have a whole chapter which is written for me in English, and I had some indications for Adriana Hunter, who is a translator, telling her how I thought this chapter in English. So my personal relationship with language is always a questioning. I'm not really sure of the words I use, even in French. I always have an ambiguity. I'm not really sure of the position of the sentences. For me, a chapter is modular, but even a paragraph is modular, and even a phrase is modular. And I can change a comma 5 times in a row, and not being sure at the end that it's the right place of a comma. And this is interesting for me. And I think this is the fact that every book which is translated is rewritten by the translator. And this is, I think, what we agree on, is that every translation is a rewriting of the book.
Thank you very much. So you started talking a little bit about your writing process. I'm sure everyone wants to know how you both write in relationship to this experimentation that we were talking about. So in both your works, I feel that there's a strong sense of mystery, some sense of dread also in your novels. Do you know, sorry, maybe with you, Hervé, do you know what's going to happen when you start writing a book? Do you already how fully is it developed in your mind when you start writing?
Well, it depends on the book. I'm sorry about this stupid answer, but it's really the fact. I mean, there are some books in which the challenge is complicated because the idea is incredibly simple, and it has to be something which to last. For example, a theater piece, 1 hour and a half. But the idea is very simple, so I don't know where I'm going. Ça marche? Yeah. I have an, it's working better. I have this necessity of pushing the idea for 1 hour, 1 hour and a half, or 1 hour and a quarter. And this is a situation in which I don't know where I'm going, but I have the idea, which is the main idea. And in other situations, the plan. Thank you so much. In other situations, the plan is very strict, which was the case for the Anomaly. It was extremely strict, and I couldn't go out of the plan for many reasons. And so there is this theory in literature, which is, I think, important, which is a theory of the beginnings and the ends. If you give a certain beginning to a book, it gives a color to the book. And as you see, the Anomaly, for example, has 11 possible first chapters, which are the 11 first chapters of the first part. But I could choose any of them to begin with. And I had to choose a color. So, yes, sometimes I have the idea, and I have to make the plan after, and sometimes I have a plan. I don't know for you, Katie.
I just wanted to quickly touch on something you were saying earlier about kind of having a certain amount of uncertainty in terms of your own relationship to language, and I think that's very, very true, and I think that's especially true, you know, for me as a writer in English, which is such a dominant language within the landscape of kind of literature and publishing in general, and that's something that I'm always very, very conscious of. I think I'm always trying to find ways to kind of detonate the language a little bit, to kind of try to move away from its smoothness and its authority, and to some extent, I think the minute the prose is coming too quickly or too easily, I become suspicious and I start to want to kind of throw sand in the gears a little bit and to trouble that smoothness. I'm very suspicious of when I'm writing of a prose that's coming too easily. I'm worried about being kind of, you know, of having a kind of infatuation of your own prose, which is a kind of vanity, which I think is death for a writer. So I think it just in terms of that, of just creating fiction in the relationship to language, that's something that's very important to me, not just on the level of style, but also to a certain extent on the level, I think, of probably politics as well. In terms of writing process and knowing what's going to happen, I think there's, and maybe you're alluding to this a little bit, there's a kind of distinction between knowing what's going to happen in the plot and knowing what's going to happen in the book, because I think sometimes I know what's going to happen in terms of event, but I don't know what will happen in the book in order to get me to that event, and that process of discovery is quite important. I think the moment at which you kind of know the kind of targets that you're hitting and the events that you have to move through, and if you know how you're going to get from A to B to all the way to Z, there's a kind of liveness, I think, that goes out of the process, and that becomes immediately less interesting to me. So I think if I can see all the way through to the end, then I already know there's a problem of some kind in the book, and that there's not enough to sustain or engage the process for the year or two that it takes to produce a manuscript.
Thank you. I would like to ask you, Hervé, about something that Katie just said. This idea of like to trouble that the smoothness of language, the creating friction. Isn't it like what the Oulipo does? Could you tell us a little bit more about the Oulipo?
It's exactly that. I mean, what you are talking about is finally the language as the water that comes from, a rubber tube when you water the garden. And the use of constraint for me, if I can use a metaphor, I hate metaphors, but sometimes they are useful and sometimes they work. And this one works. It's the constraint for me is you have this water coming out of the tube. I don't know if the tube is the right word. Anyway, I think you know what I mean. And you push at the end of the tube. And what happens is that the water goes further. And maybe if you are lucky and strong enough, your water can reach the end of the garden without you moving. which is the purpose of it. I mean, it's to be lazy as much as possible. And so the idea of constraint for me is this, is reaching a point that you would never reach with a normal language, with the first flow, first words. So you rewrite, and sometimes you use constraints to find paths and to find ways that you would never have found without a path. And to be more explicit, there are two ways in Oulipo which are conflicting always. One of the ways is using constraint on the language itself, like, for example, the famous book of Pérec, which is avoid in English, which doesn't use the letter I, la disparition in French. And this is an extreme, strong carcan? Well, I don't know. It's complicated. Constraint. Extreme strong constraint. But there are also very more fluid constraints, like, for example, using a certain order of appearance of the characters or of the feelings inside the book, which are dictated by the constraint, and that you have to deal with to make the book work in a direction you haven't anticipated. And that interests me, because it leads me to places I haven't thought I would be able to go, or that I didn't think that the fiction would lead me to. And this interests me because it's not in the structure of the book at the beginning, but it is induced by the use of a constraint. And this is very interesting for a writer, having to reach a place, in an island in a sea where you don't know that the island exists before the constraints builds it.
Thank you very much.
Sorry for the metaphor.
It's okay. And you both also have a very specific relation to voice, I would say, and that also enlightens everything else we have been saying. So, Katie, you use first-person narrators. In Intimacies, the voice is very guarded, and in your last book, the question of the reliability, of the narrator is also asked. So how do you get to that specific voice that you have and that you can sort of recognize from one book to the other, even though the books are very different from each other?
Yeah, I think the first-person voice, I would say the conflict and the tension in first person which interests me is that of the relationship to authority, and trying to question and undermine that. And it's tricky because I think, I've used, the books are different, but they're related in some way. And I think over the course of these three books in particular, the voice has become easier to me. And I fear I have more authority with the voice, which is almost the opposite of what I want to do. So I think in my most recent book, which is the one here, I think I've really tried to question that through form and structure rather than simply through voice. But the voice was interesting to me when it had a troubled relationship to certainty and to authority. So the character never knows. She's very unwilling to commit to the position of knowledge, which is how I pass through the world, by the way. I always feel that I'm the person who does not know. I feel like I'm always the person who's trying to understand. And so that's a voice that I inhabit quite naturally. But I think it creates a kind of instability because to a certain extent we have been trained to read first-person narrators who are in the position of knowing and who are in the position of telling a story. You're a first-person narrator because you have a story to tell. And I'm much more interested in a first-person narrator who's not sure what the shape of the story is. So in my last book, which was set in a war crimes tribunal, which was loosely based on the ICC in The Hague, she's a character who's observing a trial that's unfolding. The narrative that is coming to her is very, very fractured. She's working as an interpreter, so she is often so close and so proximate to the language of the trial that she can't actually discern its meaning. But all around her, she is surrounded by people whose very job it is to create narrative and to create a definitive story, whether it is the prosecution or the defense or the media. And so in a way, she's in the book, to me, to occupy the person who is, I think resist is too strong of a word, but who occupies a space that is trying to deny narrative clarity and is trying to deny the kind of authority of storytelling. And it's a funny position, I think, to some extent, to occupy as a novelist, because storytelling is our craft and it's what we do. But I think in the novel, in this one, in all of them, they're very suspicious of the facility and the power of storytelling. You know, I think every single writer is very aware of the degree to which language is very much a double-edged sword. It can be used to question, it can be used to make people think anew, but it also has extraordinary powers of persuasion. It can be used to flatten discourse, as we are seeing right now. And so that kind of sense of both the possibility and the dangers of storytelling and of language are, I think, central to how I think about voice.
And that's why your books are really so fascinating. Yeah, this idea of uncertainty against the power of a very simple narrative that just flattens everything is very striking, and I think it's very useful today. So I really appreciated that in your work. Hervé, you use a lot of different voices in your very different books. So you've written theater, as I mentioned, so the dialogue. You're using the third person in the Anomaly through like a big amount of characters. And in your latest book, The Name on the Wall, you use the first person, and it's openly, I would say, autobiographical, if I'm correct. And in poetry, it's another voice also. And when you write for the Oulipo, I guess. So could you tell us more about that and how it relates to everything else we've said?
Talking about the name of the wall, I make a prologue. I write a prologue in which I should tell you first very quickly the story of the name of the wall. I bought 10 years ago. I bought a house and there was a name of the wall, and the name was the name of André Schex. And I discovered during the confinement, during the lockdown, that he was a maquisard, a young resistant who died when he was 20. So I decided for 2024 to write for his centennial century of living, if he had lived, a book. And talking about the way it is written, in the prologue, I decide to explain how I'm going to write it. And I use I try to explain to the reader that I'm going to try to be sincere and not to use artificial ways of writing, which is complicated because you want to touch the reader, and at the same time, you don't want to be, how could I say, you don't want to be using the death of this young man for your own book. So it's complicated. And I use the fact that when you go back to the line, it is to underline something. But if you use it too much, it loses its strength to lead you to a path which is insincere and very gross. So this idea of finding your voice for speaking of someone who is dying at 20, sorry, I moved. It is very complicated. And there is also something which is very interesting, which when you write about a character, which I have discovered, it is that, and I'm talking about my emotion, and it's very strange. It is, this emotion is new for me. When I began to write the book, I had no emotion, because I didn't know the guy. So it was a very simple book to write. And the more it goes, and the more I speak about him, strange.
But thank you for sharing that
No,
with us.
it's about the voice, you know. It's exactly this. Finding your voice.
It's very interesting. It's also like finding this voice and giving uncovering the story of this forgotten character, because you see this name on the wall of your house, and then you see that it's on the Monument aux Morts in the center of the village, and then while doing that you do something else. You talk about history, And
well, I don't want to monopolize about other subjects, but it's the funny thing when you write a book like this is the inquiry. And I was very lucky. I mean, I had the opportunity of meeting people who had a box, a very small box. So I had photographs, I had tracks, I had leaflets, and had everything about him. So I used it to write the book, and this is, when I say writing under constraint, it is using constraint of the pictures and all the life which is given to you. And it's a very new thing to me. I mean, I have never done this. Having all the documents and about a young man and trying to make the best of it. So, I don't know why I'm so much moved. But anyway, it is the idea of having a lead, a thread of life and to use it as a constraint for writing is very interesting. It was, as a writer, it was a very interesting new thing for me to discover that.
And when you write the other books that are not in the first person, how do you find your voice? How do you decide what person you're going to write with, and how is it? I guess it's different for every book, and as I mentioned, like all your books are so different from each other that it's difficult to generalize, but can you give us another example?
Well, sometimes I think it's easier for me to work from a hill, which is a hill of a writer, another writer. I wrote a book from the hill of Italo Calvino, which is, I read all the books of Italo Calvino. I had read all of them, but I reread all of them when I was writing my book to stay in this voice, in this Italian voice, very Latin, very fluid, very aerial. And this type of style is something that comes from another book. So I live in a world of a certain writer to write a book. This happens sometimes, and it's okay because it's not only a homage and it's not only an influence. It is something more complicated than influence. I don't believe in the word of influence. I think that if it's not really being influenced, it's the fact that another writer has an echo in you, which is about the same. But it's a bit different because there's more of you than the simple influence. So this is why there are writers that don't interest me, that I know that you are great writers, but they don't interest me. And speaking of this, finding the point of view for writing is really this. Riding is interesting because it is also a riding. It is a horse which is not you, it is the other writer.
So it leads us, I think, very interestingly to like the broader philosophy of what art and what writing is supposed to do. And so art, writing can move us, as Hervé just showed us, but it also can unsettle us in many different ways. So could you tell us more, maybe Katie, about how like the way you write, the way you try to really deal with this instability? How does it? What does it do to the world? What would you like to achieve through this kind of unsettling of the reader?
Yeah, I mean, it's such an excellent and complicated question for me. I mean, I think something that I feel strongly that I would like to do in my fiction, and I don't know if I manage, but what I would like to do is to write something that is very open to interpretation by the reader. So in that sense, I hope to write something where the outcome is not terribly predetermined by me, and the effect on the reader is not terribly controlled by me in some way. I mean, I think I very rarely write with a clear, certainly not with a clear message or any answers of any kind, but I think I don't even necessarily have a kind of experience that I hope for a reader to have. I mean, what I hope instead is to try to write a book that is open enough so that the reader can kind of step inside and make the book with me. And so it's very much the way when you said with the translator, and of course that's one of the few truly collaborative experience, not in my life, but in my writing life, that I've had is being translated, where the book is written with the translator. I hope very much to write something that could be the same, so that it's an experience of collaboration with the reader, and so that the book is made hand in hand with the reader. So in that sense, I think I don't know what I want the result to be. I don't know what I want the impact to be. I think all I hope to do is to keep the reader sufficiently interested so that they don't put the book down.
Thank you, Katie. I'm turning to you, Hervé. So what would you like to achieve when you write? And I wanted to refer to a quote that is in the Anomaly. So Victor Mieser, this writer, the writer of the Anomaly, says, and I'm translating myself into English, we're willing to bend reality if it means not losing altogether. So this idea of bending reality is interesting, I think, in this current context. And what, I don't know if it's funny or really sad, but
it's both. It's both.
So what could you say about that? And I have another question that is directly related to it. Would you say that the Oulipo can also be political?
It's Horace Walpole that said that the world is a tragedy for those that feel, and it's a comedy for those that think. So it's quite a good quote. And we are in this situation. So we can think it is sad, and we can think it is funny at the same time. Is Oulipo political? There's two answers. The answer is yes. It has been founded by people who, if you look at them, there were either resistance in 1960. We had like Italo Calvino or like Raymond Queneau or like others. And at the same time, it has not been founded on a political point of view. It's just a group of work of people who want to work together. So it is not a political group at all. It had one statement years ago against the National Front, but that's all. And it's because Georges Perec, for example, his mother was deported to Auschwitz, and she died there. And of course, the idea of anti-fascism is very deep inside, because in Europe it has flesh and it has blood flowing through the veins of members of the Oulipo, through family and so on. But at the same time, it's just a movement which is interesting in literature and the links between literature and structure. It is not a political group, but it's always political to write, because it's a willing act of writing. Literature is only that, a willing act of writing, good or bad.
Talking about who gets to tell the story, who gets to write to tell the story in your books, Katie. So there's a gender aspect also that I'm interested in. So you were talking about authority earlier. Is there like also a political aspect to that? The fact that you have a female voice in all your novels?
Yeah, absolutely, and I agree that every time you write, it is a political act, and every book has politics in it, whether you like it or not. And some books have politics I agree with, some books have politics I strongly disagree with. I think the question of where your eye falls as a writer tells a great deal to the world about where you stand politically. It is important to me to have female narrators. I think in the last book in particular, I was thinking a great deal about the question of who tells the story, because it is set in a war crimes tribunal, and one of the central characters is loosely modeled on Laurent Gbagbo, the former president of Côte d'Ivoire. And I think the question of who in a trial narrates what has happened was very, very important to me. And I always knew that in writing this particular character, I never wanted to, even in fictional terms, give him so-called the opportunity to tell his story. So I always knew from the very beginning that what was important to me was that the narration of what had happened in this country, which is unnamed in the novel, would be told by one of the victims of these acts of aggression. So that's a very, very small thing, but it was something that was important to me in terms of, in a book that is concerned with the question of who gets to tell the story, to think even within the terms of the narrative in quite a literal way, who was going to tell the story. So it is very much narrated by somebody who is adjacent to the seat of power rather than in the seat of power, but in this moment where the key events of the novel to a certain extent are being told, it was important to me that voice was given to a victim rather than the perpetrator of this genocide. Obviously, another issue then for me becomes the question of what authority I have or what right I have myself as an American writer to tell this particular story. And which was very, very much alive to me when I was writing the book and something that I thought about a great deal. And the only way I could think of addressing that was by writing that directly into the text. So in this scene, when this victim is testifying, we receive the scene through the point of view of the interpreter who is tasked with interpreting her words and who then directly says that the kind of speaking the first person I of this character, which is what we do as novelists, is uncomfortable to her, that she has this sense that this I that she is speaking, this voice that she's inhabiting isn't large enough for both her and for this character. And so the only way I can think about kind of trying to think in a sensitive way about this question of who tells a story was just to write it directly into the novel.
And it's like the scene you're talking about is so interesting because it's also the testimony of the victim is in the local language, and then it goes through another interpreter, and then through a second one, and so it's filtered, and at the same time makes it so powerful.
Yeah, I mean that was something I was really thinking about a great deal, because the official languages of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, are French and English, which are of course two colonial imperial languages, and then very, very often the testimony of the people who are both on trial and testifying is translated through various languages before it reaches a language of record, which is typically English and French.
So, and I found it really interesting, like the way you talk about the colonial. So first in your Gone to the Forest, your 2013 novel that is set in a colonial country where there's like civil unrest and political change. And then in Intimacies, so it's happened at The Hague, as you mentioned. And so you see like this charismatic president who is complicit of genocide. And also what is really interesting about your novel is the way you talk about how the court is also a colonial thing in itself. So you are making it much more complex than it actually looks like at first. And could you develop that?
Yeah, it was interesting publishing the book, because I think the ICC is a tremendously important institution. I think it's absolutely vital. I believe so strongly in these international institutions. At the same time, I think I believe in them so strongly that I feel they have to be held up to the very highest standard, or ethical and moral standard, and to a certain extent, it is an institution like any institution. It works in concert with many, many governments, including the United States, which is not a party of the Rome Statute, and doesn't fall within the jurisdiction of the ICC, famously. But I felt it was part of the task of engaging with the subject matter was to look at how the institution is formulated, who is funding it, down to what the official languages are, how power trickles through the institution. I think that's something, I'm never sure what a novel is good for, but I think a novel is very good at tracking the relationship between the individual and the institution, to kind of examine how the institution exerts power over the individual. I think that is something actually novels do wonderfully well. And so I think in this case, I felt there was no way of writing the novel without looking at the institution and thinking about what its own tendencies and prejudices and institutional qualities might be. And it is, I think it was until very, very recently the only people for whom warrants of arrest have been issued were for former leaders of African countries, which is very, very notable, and that has recently changed.
Thank you, Katie. So my last question will be for you, Hervé. So you've always been a very politically committed, engaged writer, and especially you're like fighting with different ways, like writing articles, but also writing different books against the far right in France. And we were talking about that in the green room. Could you, I know you feel like it's a difficult task, but what do you think can be done? And you were also mentioning humor, which I found interesting.
Yes, well, weapon, yeah. Maybe the microphone, maybe it's my voice, I don't know. Yeah, well, it's in fact that's true. The weapon of humor is incredibly strong, but at a certain moment, you can't defeat Hitler with jokes, you know. So some other situations have to be taken care of. What I think is talking about what you were speaking about. I think as for novel writers like us, the important thing is head hopping. The idea that you can go from one head to the other one in the novel. And we write to live many lives. And we read to live many lives also. And to live many lives means to go inside the head of the victim, but to go inside the head of the perpetrator, and to go inside all the heads of characters of the books. And this is a very interesting task because it is a technique, it is a literary technique. It is what you call head hopping, what we call discours indirect libre, free indirect discourse. It allows the readers to make an opinion and to live the complexity of the world. And this is the important task we have to make lively and to allow us to do in books again and again. And this is through this political way of showing the world to the reader that I think we can advance. I don't see any other way. And as readers and as writers, we must understand that we speak to a very few population, very small population. We act by capillarity, as I said. We act by giving a small impulse that we hope will, like a small stone which is falling from the top of a cliff, is going to make other rocks fall with us, with a little stone we have thrown. But we address a very small amount of people. In the contrary of movies or of TV or of internet. So we have to address in a certain way that is convincing and that is opening minds, that's all.
Thank you very much to both of you. That was such a stimulating conversation. I give this hope and enthusiasm for what's coming next, hopefully. So I would like to open the floor to you. I'm sure you have a lot of questions to ask to Katie and to Hervé. There's a microphone circulating.
Good evening. Thank you very much for this exchange. It was very interesting. My question goes to Monsieur Le Tellier. Actually, I recently read Toutes les familles heureuses, which is, I think, autobiographical. So it was your voice, or so I was wondering if you used fiction by writing this in order to, how can I say, as a literary strategy, in order to touch us more, because you said, unlike this young man, you didn't do that too much because it was his life, but there it's your life. So did you use fiction?
No, in this book? No, in this book, not at all. In fact, when you write an autobiography, which is not an autobiography, it's just the story of my life between my 0 and my 20s. So it's, I'm over 20, as you noticed. So it's not an autobiography, it's just the memories of my youth. The interesting thing with memories is that it's bricks floating in the air, and you try to make it a wall so that it holds all together, but you are not very sure that the cement is real. So I tried to make the cement as real as possible. Sometimes I had scenes I wanted to talk about, but from these scenes I have 4 free images, and that's all. And the whole job was to tell the story as sincerely as I could. And I know it's not the truth, but it's my truth. And it's okay. I made an inquiry around my family to know what was really the facts. But beyond the facts, there's the writing, and sometimes you have to invent. But the invention is always, it's a true invention. Let us say so. But it is a very unique book in my work. It's a very personal book. And so there's no other one like this, and there will not be another one like this, I think.
You talk about uncertainty. And most people, the survival mechanism is about control. I'm wondering what your relationship is to uncertainty and how you live your life in that space. Yes.
Thank you for that question. Probably not terribly happily. Like I said, that position of not knowing is a position that I occupy every single day. And I am a kind of perennial student as well. I have too many degrees because I think I was so committed to this kind of quest of trying to acquire more knowledge until I realized that no amount of knowledge was going to give me the conviction or the certainty that I thought I needed to navigate the world. It means that I'm a slow thinker, I think. It takes me time to think. It takes me time to process what is happening in the world around me. And of course, we are in an accelerationist period when speed seems to be increasingly of importance. So I operate slowly, I think. And I try to stay committed to that slowness. And I try to be careful in how I think and how I form my opinions. Because I actually, I have to say right now, I feel like I have a lot of certainty about how I think about what is happening in the world, in fact. But I think my intellectual impulse is to try to slow that down and break it apart, which is not, I suppose, 100 miles away from what you were talking about, occupying multiple points of view. But yeah.
Can I answer? I was working for Le Monde, for the newspaper Le Monde for 15 years. And my job was to write 3 lines every day. And to write these 3 lines, it took me 2 or 3 hours. Because I didn't know what I thought. And I wanted to say something which was not an impulse from, a corner of a table. So sometimes it took me really hours to know what I really thought and to confront it to the reality of a situation. And a certainty, I think, is a necessity to understand the world, because it's if it was certain, we would know.
I just want to quickly jump in with a book I read recently that I loved, which is the new Emmanuel Carrère book, which is coming out in English very, very soon, about the trial of the Bataclan massacre. And one of the things that I found really extraordinary about that book is that he was writing a weekly column, as I understand it. So he was writing it very, very quickly, 1,000 words a week or something like that. But the way he is able to inhabit uncertainty and sustain it over the period of writing this weekly column over the course of this very, very long trial into a book is really, it's not simply an aesthetic or a creative feat. It felt to me very much like an ethical commitment and a kind of moral duty that he felt. And so, I mean, I could be wrong. You would know much more than I would, but there was something about that I found so deeply and profoundly admirable. He's a writer who I admire for so many reasons, but in this one, it was really that commitment to saying, I don't know, is what it felt like to me, and to sustaining that in the face of terrible atrocity, and to not lapse into the comfort of certainty that I found ethically admirable and extraordinary. But I don't.
And this is the last question.
Hi, good evening. So there's something very interesting with both of your novels, is that they're at the same time extremely anchored into the societal trends of their time, but also into the internal psychology of the characters. So my question was, how much do you get inspiration from the evolving trends, both politically, psychologically, environmentally in society to write your novels?
I'm thinking about the right answer. For me, I use a lot of documentation because documentation brings life in the novel, brings reality inside the novel, and brings also narrative inside the novel. Sometimes you have things that come from the documentation. And documentation, of course, is very diverse. It comes from as much the social networks, but it also comes from books. So c'est le grand écart, how would you say? But I don't really make a survey of psychology of the world. I just try to, as I said, when I speak about someone, I try to know who he is and how he thinks, to be as accurate as possible, even if he's a horrible guy. And I think it's very important when you have somebody who is hateable to be able to go inside his brain and to show his thought and to educate the reader, for example, to the possibility of confronting yourself to a voice which is horrible and to be able to show a psyche which is a horrible psyche. This goes to the psychological point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I love what you just said. I mean, one of the things that is a kind of thing that that is often said about literature that I slightly hate, and one of the kind of uses of literature is that it induces us towards a tendency towards empathy, and that it's a kind of tool to make people more empathetic. I think that is true, but I'm also interested in the dangers of empathy to a certain extent. And in my last book, in particular, the character finds herself all too permeable and too porous in a way to the kind of point of view of somebody who has committed war crimes, and that kind of opens an ethical dilemma to her. I mean, my last book is very much grounded in a particular moment. It's 2016. It's just before the Brexit vote, and a lot of things that took place, obviously, here as well. In the wake of that, and a kind of questioning of the role and place of international institutions. But I don't think I never think I'm writing to a moment in any way. I think I just live in a moment, and so it's impossible that it doesn't end up on the page, in the sense that I am 100% certain never write a novel about the pandemic, but I'm sure the pandemic will be everywhere in everything I write, because that was simply the reality that I was living in on a day-to-day basis ongoing, but for many, many years. And similarly, whether or not, I think you can't write from out of the context in which you're living. I think that's very, very hard. I think even when you are trying to write in the most abstracted way, I think the kind of muck of the world you live in is going to infiltrate your fictional world, and I think that's what makes fiction interesting. So it's very rarely a kind of conscious attempt to speak. Certainly I'm the least zeitgeisty person, sadly, in the world, but I think nonetheless it is you write from the world you live in. Does that answer your question? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hervé, Katie, Laurence. For those of you who were with us before, you know the drill. Book signing will be in the bookshop today. So book sales in the next room, signing in the room after that, and we'll need to clean the floor in 5 to 10 minutes. Thank you so much.